In October of 2001, a 25-year-old college student named Christine Franke was shot to death inside her own apartment in Orlando, Florida. She had been robbed, and she had been assaulted by a man who, as far as anyone would ever be able to determine, was a complete stranger to her. There was no connection between them, no prior relationship, no motive anyone could trace, nothing at all linking this killer to this young woman, except for one thing: the DNA he left behind at the scene. A random stranger had walked into Christine Franke's home, taken her life, and walked back out into a city of strangers. And that is the hardest kind of murder to solve, because it severs the very first thread investigators pull on. Normally, you solve a killing by asking who would want the victim dead. You work outward from her relationships, her enemies, her life. But when the killer is a stranger, chosen at random, there is no relationship to investigate. There is just a body and a genetic profile of a man who could be anyone, anywhere. For 17 years, that is exactly where the Christine Franke case sat. They had his DNA. It matched no one. And a random killer stayed free. If cases like this one are why you're here, the ones where an uncatchable stranger is finally caught by a method that didn't exist when the crime was committed, subscribe to Decades Cold and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. This is exactly what we do here. Then, in 2018, investigators did something that almost no police department in the country had done yet. They took the killer's DNA and they searched a public genealogy database, not looking for him, but for his relatives. And the thread that finally unraveled this case belonged to a man named John Hogan, a second cousin of the killer, a man who had never heard of Christine Franke in his life. He had uploaded his DNA to that database for one simple reason: curiosity about his own family history. And in doing so, without the faintest idea he was doing it, he handed detectives the man who had murdered a stranger 17 years earlier. This is a story about justice. A random killer, uncatchable by every traditional means, finally found, convicted, and sent to prison for the rest of his life. But it is also a story about something stranger and genuinely unsettling that this case makes impossible to ignore. It's a story about the fact that your DNA is never only yours. That when you spit into a tube to learn about your ancestors, you may be exposing a relative you have never met. And that to nail down this case, investigators didn't only rely on a curious cousin, they also, by her own account, obtained DNA from the killer's own mother without telling her the truth about why. This is the story of Christine Franke, the stranger who caught her killer without ever knowing it, and the hard questions hiding inside one of the most powerful tools in modern justice. Christine Franke was 25 years old, and she was building the kind of life that's all promise. She was a student at the University of Central Florida, in Orlando, and she was majoring in education. Think about what that choice says about a person. She wanted to be a teacher. She was preparing to spend her working life in a classroom, shaping kids, doing one of the most fundamentally hopeful and generous jobs there is. That was the future Christine was working toward in the fall of 2001. Degree, classroom, a life spent helping children learn. She was, by every account, a beloved daughter. Her mother, Tina Franke, would become the central figure in the long fight for justice that followed. A mother who waited, as it turned out, more than 2 decades to learn who killed her child, and who never stopped pushing for an answer. Years later, when the case was finally resolved, Tina spoke about the investigators who, in her words, never gave up on her daughter's case. That's the voice of a parent who spent the better part of her life carrying a grief with no resolution, holding on to hope through 17 years of silence. I always try to pause on the ordinariness of these young women's lives because the ordinariness is the tragedy. Christine wasn't living dangerously. She was a college student in her own apartment, studying to be a teacher. There was nothing about her life that invited what happened to her. And that's precisely what makes her case so frightening and so important. Because the person who killed her didn't target her for anything she did, or anyone she knew. He targeted her, it appears, simply because she was there, a stranger who crossed her path, in her own home. and ended everything she was building. She should have graduated. She should have stood in front of a classroom. Instead, her mother spent 22 years waiting for a name. On October 21, 2001, Christine Franke was in her apartment in the Audubon Park area of Orlando, and a man came into that apartment. When it was over, Christine had been robbed, she had been sexually assaulted, and she had been shot in the head. She was discovered when a neighbor came to the apartment and found the door unlocked. The neighbor pushed it open and found Christine, fatally shot. I'm going to state those facts once, plainly, and then leave them, because the details serve nothing, and Christine deserves better than to be reduced to them. She was 25. She was killed in her own home. Everything about the crime pointed to a stranger. There was no sign that Christine had any relationship with her killer, no history between them, no reason rooted in her life for this to have happened. And that shaped the entire investigation to come, because a stranger homicide is, in a specific way, the hardest case there is. When a victim knows her killer, the investigation has a map. You interview the people in her life. You look at the boyfriend, the ex, the co-worker, the person with a grudge, and the answer is usually somewhere in that web. But when the killer is a stranger who chose his victim at random, that map is blank. There's no one in Christine's life to suspect, because the killer wasn't in her life at all. He came from outside it, did what he did, and returned to being one anonymous man among millions. But he had made the mistake that, ultimately, undoes so many of these offenders. In the course of the assault, he left a significant amount of his own DNA at the scene, biological evidence that carried his complete genetic identity. In 2001, investigators collected and preserved that evidence. They had, in the most literal sense, the killer himself, reduced to a genetic code. What they did not have, and would not have for a very long time, was any way to attach that code to a human being with a name and a face. The Orlando Police Department did the standard thing with the DNA profile they'd developed. They ran it against CODIS, the National Criminal Database, searching for a convicted offender whose genetic profile matched. And they got the answer that opens so many of our episodes. Nothing. No match. Christine's killer had not been convicted of a qualifying crime that would have put his DNA into the system. As far as CODIS was concerned, he did not exist. And so the case ran into the wall that defines the stranger homicide cold case. Investigators, by their own account, quickly hit dead ends. There was no relationship to investigate, no database match to chase, no witness who could name the man. There was only a perfect genetic profile of a killer, and no way in the world to turn it into an identity. That profile sat in evidence, complete and useless, while the years went by. 1 year, 5, 10. Christine's mother waited. The killer, whoever he was, lived his life somewhere out in the world, uncaught, quite possibly assuming he had gotten away with it forever. And by any reasonable measure of the tools available at the time, he had. This is the exact scenario in which the traditional playbook simply runs out of pages. Fingerprints, if there were any usable ones, hadn't matched. The DNA hadn't matched. There were no leads to follow. A random killer who commits a single crime against a stranger, leaves no witnesses, and never lands in a criminal database is, under the old rules, close to unfindable. He hadn't been clever. He'd just been lucky in the most basic way. Lucky that the one piece of evidence that could identify him, his DNA, had nothing to be compared against. For 17 years, Christine Franke's murder was a profile in search of a person. And then the search changed shape entirely. The first modern attempt to break the case came around 2016, when the Orlando Police Department received a grant and turned to a company called Parabon Nanolabs to try DNA phenotyping. The technology, which we've discussed on this channel, that reads the genes for physical appearance and builds a composite image of a suspect from the DNA alone. From Christine's killer's genetic profile, Parabon generated a predicted description and a composite, a male suspect with a particular set of physical characteristics in a certain age range. The police released that composite to the public, hoping someone would recognize the face the DNA had drawn. And here, unlike some of the cases we've covered, The composite alone did not crack it. Investigators, by their own account, didn't get the leads they needed from the image. It's an honest and useful reminder that phenotyping is a tool for generating leads, not a guarantee. Sometimes the DNA-drawn face lands in front of the right person, and sometimes it doesn't reach them, or the likeness isn't close enough to spark recognition. In Christine's case, the face wasn't enough. But the same DNA that had drawn that face could do something else, something far more powerful and far more revealing about the strange new world we've entered. Because the physical traits phenotyping reads are, in the words of the arrest warrant in this case, inherited from our biological families. The very same genetic markers that let a lab predict a suspect's appearance are the markers we share, in traceable patterns, with our relatives. And that meant Christine's killer's DNA didn't just describe him, it connected him, invisibly, undeniably, to every relative he had. The investigators just needed a way to find those relatives, and by 2018 there was one. In 2018, the case was handed to the emerging power of forensic genetic genealogy, with the renowned genetic genealogist C.C. Moore, working through Parabon, taking on the puzzle. And the approach was the one this channel has explained many times, but Christine's case illustrates its human strangeness better than almost any other. Investigators took the killer's DNA profile and uploaded it to GEDmatch, a free, public genealogy database where ordinary people upload their own DNA results to find relatives and explore their ancestry. The system doesn't look for an exact match to the killer, it looks for partial matches. People who share meaningful stretches of DNA with him, which is to say, his relatives. And it found one. A man named John Hogan had uploaded his own genetic data to that database, and the system flagged him as a relative of the unknown killer. Specifically, John Hogan turned out to be a second cousin of the man who murdered Christine Franke. Now here is the part I want you to sit with, because it is the emotional and ethical core of this entire episode. John Hogan had never heard of Christine Franke. He had no connection to the crime, no knowledge of it, nothing. He was not a suspect, not a witness, not involved in any way. He was simply a man who, like millions of people, had gotten curious about where his family came from and had uploaded his DNA to a website to find out. That's all. From John Hogan's DNA, C.C. Moore built out the family tree, tracing the branches down through the relatives until, as the investigators put it, they eliminated most of the family and narrowed it to two people, a man named Benjamin Holmes and his brother. The killer had been found not through anything he did, but through a cousin he may never have met, who had no idea he was doing it. I want to stop the narrative here and dwell on what just happened, because it is the thing that makes genetic genealogy both a miracle and a genuine dilemma, and Christine's case states it with unusual clarity. Benjamin Holmes, if he ever thought about it, would have believed his DNA was his own private business. He had, apparently, never been convicted of a crime that would put him in CODIS, so by the old rules, his genetic identity was safe, his to keep. But that belief, which almost all of us share, turns out to be an illusion. Because Benjamin Holmes could not control what his relatives did. He could keep his own DNA out of every database in the world, and it would not matter, because his second cousin, a man he may never have met, put a version of that shared genetic signature online, voluntarily, for reasons that had nothing to do with him. And that was enough. This is the fundamental truth that genetic genealogy runs on. You cannot keep your DNA private, because it isn't only yours. You share it, in traceable pieces, with everyone you're related to, cousins you've never met, relatives generations removed, and any one of them, by uploading their own DNA for the most innocent reason imaginable, exposes a piece of you. For catching killers, this is extraordinary. It means the era in which a stranger could commit a single crime and vanish is closing, because he cannot prevent his relatives from existing or from being curious about their heritage. John Hogan committed no crime, knew nothing, consented to nothing related to this case, and yet his spit in a tube reached across a family tree and pulled a murderer into the light. That is a genuinely astonishing thing, and it has brought justice to hundreds of victims who would otherwise have none. But notice the discomfort riding alongside the wonder. John Hogan never agreed to help police catch a relative. He uploaded his DNA to find his roots, and it was used, without his knowledge, as a search tool in a criminal investigation. Multiply that by the millions of people in these databases, and you arrive at a strange new reality. Whether or not you ever take a DNA test, if enough of your relatives do, you are effectively in a law enforcement database, searchable, traceable, exposed, having never consented to any of it. In Christine's case, that reality delivered justice, but it delivers it by quietly enrolling all of us, and everyone we're related to, into a system almost none of us signed up for. The genealogy had narrowed the case to two brothers, Benjamin Holmes and his sibling. But you know the rule by now. Genetic genealogy is a lead, not proof. The family tree pointed at these two men. It could not, by itself, say which one, or convict anyone. For that, investigators needed the actual DNA of the actual suspects, compared directly against the killer's profile from the crime scene, and they needed to get it discreetly. So they did what has become standard practice, and what we've seen close case after case. They collected discarded DNA. From Holmes's brother, investigators obtained a thrown-away Gatorade bottle. From Benjamin Holmes himself, they collected a cigar and a beer can that, they said, they watched him throw away. Those items went to the lab, and the DNA on Benjamin Holmes's discarded beer can was an exact match to the DNA the killer had left on Christine Franke's body in 2001. That was the confirmation. The genealogy had pointed, the discarded can proved. Benjamin Holmes was the man. But there is one more piece of how investigators built this case, and I include it deliberately, because it sharpens the ethical questions we've been circling. According to reporting, investigators also approached Benjamin Holmes's mother. Detectives came to her and, by her own account, they swabbed her cheek for DNA without telling her the true reason they wanted it. She believed she was helping with something else. It was only later, when her son was arrested, that she realized what had actually happened, and she would go on to say plainly that the police had deceived her. Now, let's be clear and fair about the legal reality. Collecting a person's discarded, abandoned DNA is well established and lawful, and using a ruse to obtain a sample sits in a grayer, more contested area. But police do use such tactics. The point isn't that anyone broke the law. The point is what it reveals. To catch Christine's killer, the investigation reached not only through an unwitting cousin's ancestry test, but through a mother who was, by her telling, misled into giving up her own genetic material. The method's power and the method's cost were both on full display. I want to devote a section to the questions this case raises, because in 23 previous episodes, this channel has largely celebrated genetic genealogy, and rightly so. It has delivered staggering justice. But Christine Franke's case is the right moment to be honest, that the technology has a genuine other side, and thoughtful people disagree about where the lines should be. So let me lay out the debate fairly. On one side is everything this channel exists to document. Genetic genealogy has solved hundreds of cold cases that were, by every traditional measure, hopeless. It has caught serial killers who would have kept killing. It has given names back to the unidentified dead. It has freed innocent people from prison. Christine Franke's killer was a random stranger who, without this method, would almost certainly have died a free man, and her mother would have died without an answer. When you weigh a young woman's murder solved and a killer put away for life against the abstract discomfort of a database search, many people conclude, reasonably, that the trade is more than worth it. Justice for the dead and safety for the living are not small things. On the other side are concerns that are not paranoid or trivial. When you upload your DNA, you expose relatives who never consented, people who may not even know the database exists. Police access to these databases has shifted over time, sometimes without the clear, informed agreement of the people whose data is being searched. Investigators sometimes use deception, as they apparently did with Holmes's mother, to obtain genetic samples. And critics raise the specter of function creep, the worry that a tool built to catch murderers could expand, over time, to other purposes, other agencies, other uses that people never signed up for when they spat in a tube to find a great-grandparent. These are legitimate questions about consent, privacy, and the quiet expansion of genetic surveillance over a population that largely doesn't realize it's happening. I'm not going to tell you where to land on that, because it's a real values question and reasonable people weigh it differently. But I think a channel that spends its life praising this technology owes you the honest picture. It is simultaneously one of the most powerful instruments of justice ever created, and a genuine frontier in the erosion of genetic privacy. Christine's case is both of those things at once. Holding both in your head at the same time is, I'd argue, the only intellectually honest way to think about it. Benjamin Holmes was arrested in November of 2018, one of just 15 cases in the entire country, at that point, to have used genetic genealogy to make an arrest. It would take until 2023 for the case to reach its conclusion in a courtroom, and when it did, the science held up under the scrutiny of a trial. At trial, the core of the case was the DNA. A state crime lab analyst testified that the DNA collected from Benjamin Holmes in 2018, his confirmed direct sample, matched the DNA evidence found on Christine Franke's body from nearly 22 years earlier. That's the chain that matters, not the genealogy, which was the investigative lead, but the hard, direct, one-to-one comparison of Holmes's own DNA to the killer's DNA from the scene. Holmes denied any involvement in Christine's murder, but the genetic evidence was what it was. In March of 2023, Benjamin Holmes was found guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Christine's mother, Tina Franke, was there for it, after a wait almost too long to comprehend. 22 years. She spoke about the evidence with the clear-eyed conviction of someone who had thought hard about what it would mean to be wrong, and had concluded she wasn't. She said, essentially, that she would never want an innocent person wrongly accused, but that the evidence all pointed to him, and, in the phrase that has become almost a motto for this entire field, that the DNA doesn't lie. After more than 2 decades, the random stranger who walked into her daughter's home in 2001 had a name, a conviction, and a life sentence. That is a clean and complete resolution, the kind that EP after EP on this channel exists to celebrate. And it's worth celebrating here, fully, even as we hold the harder questions right alongside it. Christine Franke's case matters, I think, precisely because it refuses to be simple. It insists on being 2 things at once. The first thing it is a triumph. Maybe the purest kind this channel covers. A random stranger committed the near-perfect crime, a single killing, a victim with no connection to him, no witnesses, no presence in any criminal database. Under every traditional method, that man was uncatchable, and for 17 years he was uncaught. Genetic genealogy reached across a family tree he didn't control, through a cousin he'd never met, and pulled him out of anonymity and into a courtroom, where a jury convicted him and a judge sent him away for the rest of his life. A mother who waited 22 years got her answer. A killer who might have struck again never will. If you want a single clean argument for why this technology deserves the acclaim this channel has given it across 24 episodes, Christine Franke's case is very close to the perfect one. And the second thing it is a warning, or more precisely, an invitation to think carefully. Because the very features that made this miracle possible are the features that raise the questions. It worked because your DNA isn't only yours. It worked because an innocent man's ancestry test became a criminal search tool without his knowledge. It worked, in part, because investigators obtained a relative's DNA through deception. None of that is a reason to abandon the technology. The justice it delivers is too real and too valuable. But it is a reason to stay awake, to insist on rules and oversight and transparency, to make sure that a tool this powerful is used with care and with consent where consent is possible. The right response to Christine's case isn't fear of the science, and it isn't blind faith in it either. It's clear eyes. Celebrate the justice, watch the power, hold both. Let me bring this back, at the end, to the 2 people at the center of it, because the abstractions about databases and privacy only matter because of them. Christine Franke was going to be a teacher, That's the detail I keep returning to. She was 25, in her own apartment, studying to spend her life in a classroom with children, and a stranger took all of it away in a single evening, for reasons that had nothing to do with who she was. For 17 years, the man who did it was a ghost, a genetic profile with no face, a killer who could have been anyone. And the thing that finally gave him a face was not a detective's brilliance or a lucky witness. It was the quiet, invisible web of human relatedness. The simple biological fact that no one is genetically alone, that we are all tied to relatives we've never met, and that in the age of the DNA database, those ties can carry the truth across decades and out of the dark. And Tina Franke, Christine's mother, waited 22 years to see it happen. Whatever we conclude about the privacy questions, and they're real, and they deserve our serious attention, I don't think we get to lecture Tina Franke about them. She lived through 2 decades of not knowing who killed her daughter, and then she watched a jury convict the man the DNA identified, and she said, "The DNA doesn't lie." For her, the miracle side of this technology wasn't abstract. It was the difference between dying without an answer and finally getting one. That is worth holding on to, right next to the harder questions. Both are true. Both matter. Christine Franke should be a school teacher somewhere right now, in her 40s, with a couple of decades of students who'd remember her. Instead, she's a name we say at the end of an episode, and a reason to think hard about the tools we're building. Say her name, Christine Franke. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe, because the next one is already waiting.